Coming back to our panel 2, looking at the importance of reuse of digital identities. We have a significantly interesting panel here, so I thought I would introduce each people in turn and then sit down with them and ask them direct questions. So we have James Anderson. James Anderson has been at Barclays for 6 years, starting on the graduate programme, before stints in FX product management and as the Chief of Staff to the MD, Barclays Information Business. For the past year, James has been head of the Barclays Identity Service, looking after the solution Barclays provides as part of gov.uk Verify Federation. Big hand for James. Thank you very much. Go for each of these in turn. We're delighted to have Nick Mothershaw, Director of Fraud and Identity Solutions from Experian, Nick. Thank you very much. Welcome, Nick. Nick is responsible for the strategic development of Experian's fraud and identity solutions by both public and private sectors. Nick has been with Experian for over 15 years. Previously, Nick was director of a company providing global solutions with the broader criminal justice arena. He is the architect of the Scottish Intelligence Database, which is exporting best-of-breed UK crime management systems to Australia and the US. A big hand for Nick, please. We have Rob Yuille, Head of Retirement Policy at ABI, the Association of British Insurers. Since joining in 2012 from the Money Advice Service, he's led the ABI's work on pension flexibility and retirement choices, and now oversees policy areas including the pensions dashboard, retirement market, scams, and paying for care. Welcome, Rob. We're delighted to welcome to the panel Charlie Walton, Senior VP of Digital Identity and Products at MasterCard. Charlie's focused on expanding MasterCard's digital identification strategy and service activities to include prioritising and supporting a role with government and private sector in developing identity ecosystems and establishing partnerships in this space. Very welcome. Thank you very much, Charlie. And to our panel, we have Paul Wethersby, Senior Director of Product Management at Lexis Nexis Risk. Paul is an experienced technology professional that creates strategy and builds products to help customers better understand their customer base, to solve issues relating to customer onboarding, financial crime compliance, identity, fraud, collections, and life and pensions. So thank you very much, and welcome, Paul. Thank you very much all for joining us here today. So there's been a number of OIX-run reuse projects that James from Barclays, Nick from Experian, and Rob from ABI have all been involved in. Experian and Barclays are also identity providers to the gov.uk Verify scheme. MasterCard is a household name, a trusted brand with a trust framework or scheme that we are familiar with and may have all very different perspectives on reuse that we're very looking forward to hearing from you about. Lexis Nexis are looking at the next steps of how the attribute exchange, or attributes, i.e. the additional pieces of information additional to our name and address and date of birth may be necessary to improve security and the importance of standards if attributes are to be shared. So we wanted to focus this conversation on asking all of the panelists on the great things to share. We're going to be looking at, in turn, commercial reuse, reducing customer friction, and then standards. I'll be asking you each a few questions in turn. So first I wanted to just chat to James from Barclays. I know that Barclays have been involved in cross-border banking project, which we'll discuss later on in the conference, of course. But please, can you give more details of the reuse projects? Thank you, James.
Yeah, absolutely. So good morning, everybody. So Barclays has been involved in a couple of reuse projects, and understandably, the kind of interesting piece for us, initially at least, is around how you could use a digital identity in opening a bank account. There's a number of different facets that the piece took into account, but mainly it was looking at the customer angle. So what is it that the customer sees? How do they interact with this piece? Do they understand what a digital identity is and how they can then use it to actually physically do something? So in this case, a bank account. The piece which is on the OIX website, I'd encourage you all to go and read it if you haven't already, kind of really came down to the fact that as long as there's a simple way in which customers can understand and use this thing, then the standards that underpin, and I think we'll be talking a lot about standards as we go through today, the standards that underpin it are more kind of for the organizations piece. I don't think there's a need for a customer to understand an LOA or a KYC standard. It's more about taking the piece that they've created once and reusing many times. So I think it'd be interesting, especially with the open banking and how that comes along, which Imran and the guys were talking about earlier, kind of how customers perceive what it is that they're doing with their identity. And I think that there's a lot of work that will go on through the OIX around how organizations then perceive and build business cases to actually consume and do other things with them.
What will make digital identities a compelling proposition to RPs, the relying parties who, people who purchase this? Could you talk to that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So for a relying party, what are you looking for from a digital identity? So we've done quite a lot of research on this, and critical mass is one thing. So if I'm a relying party and I'm going to put a digital identity or a set of digital identities on my website for people to log on, there needs to be enough of them to make it an interesting proposition for me to do that implementation. If it's only a few, and what is a few? A few millions, probably only a few, then it's not really of interest unless there's some other compelling reason to introduce digital identities. So critical mass is key, and that's millions and millions of identities. But that's all very well. If I've got lots of identities, the main thing the relying party will be worried about is how does it affect their onboarding journey today, or how does it affect their log-on journey today? So everyone will have highly tuned online journeys. They will have spent huge amounts of time and money on optimizing those. They'll know precisely their abandonment rate and their conversion rates. Anything new introduced into that pipeline will have to improve that. It cannot make it any worse. We've introduced interoperability between verified digital identities and Experian identities for logging on to Credit Expert and Credit Matcher. And one of the main things we had as we're going through that project is this introduction of an Experian ID that's interoperable going to make our conversion rates on our services better, or is it going to make them worse? So even little things like you're going to type in an email address and we're going to realize that that's the one you've already used to set up a Verify ID a few months ago. So we're going to interrupt the journey and tell you that. Is that going to be a good thing that's going to make people stay in the journey and then log on with that ID, or is it going to confuse them and make them abandon? So we have to do a huge amount of testing around that to assure our own internal business that adopting a digital ID that was interoperable was a good idea. But then we have what's known as the thin file problem. Electronic identification is largely based on leveraging credit bureau data in terms of data footprints, also electoral roll and some of the data sources. There's a section of the population, largely the young, the old and the new to country, who cannot get through that process automatically. They have to fall back on manual processes. And that's very expensive for the organisations, for those relying parties. It's very inconvenient for those consumers. And that leads to abandonment. So anything that brings in the ability to address that kind of problem and get more people through instantly online is going to be very compelling, very desirable from a relying party point of view. That will, I think, offset the critical mass thing I started out with. So in a world where everything was equal, having critical mass is key. But if there's other tipping points in a digital identity adoption, such as I can get more people through, even if it's only 10% of people, of those 10% of people, I can increase my conversion rate by 10, 15%, then that's going to be very compelling. And one of the projects we've been working on is one with TISA over the past year or so now. In that, we've produced a set of wireframes that show how a customer can use a digital identity to open an ISA. And we've also explored the associated standards with that. And one of the reasons we explored the standards and mapped digital identities to AML was it was absolutely key to understand how many people we can get through compared to how many people we can get through today. And now we're on the cusp of the next phase of that project, where we want to explore in a live pilot with around 10 relying parties in the finance industry, what's it going to be like for a consumer to open an ISA or an investment account using digital identity? What's it going to be like for a relying party? What will they need to do? How will it affect their conversion rates? So exploring all of those things, not just a technical project. In fact, the technology is not really a worry. It's more about exploring it from the consumer point of view, from the relying party point of view, and also the legal framework that needs to go around that.
Just kind of extending that really, what could the blockers to the RP adoption be? Could you talk to us for some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So blockers, what would stop an RP? Not enough IDs. So in a way, it's the reverse of everything I just talked about. So if none of those things are true, then the RP won't be interested. But then a blocker, beyond all of that, let's say we get all of that right. If it's technically too difficult for the RP to implement, that's going to be a blocker. It's going to mean their adoption is going to be difficult. Everyone's got busy IT roadmaps. The easier it is, the better. So, for instance, we can't expect a relying party to do complex matching every time a user involves with them, engages with them. So, user would choose an IDP. That IDP would then stick for that relying party. That's what our research tells us that relying party wants. If I choose to log on with post office to a retailer in the future, next time I log on to that retailer, the retailer will expect me to log on with post office again. They don't want to have to resolve multiple IDPs. They don't want that task. If any resolution has to be done, the hub that's bringing them together needs to deal with that, not push that down to the relying parties. So making it technically easy and making it contractually easy is going to be key as well. If we push lots of things down to the relying party in terms of obligations, there's obviously got to be the right level of security around all of this. That's very, very key. But if we push too much down on the relying party, if we get them into a situation where they've got to have auditors, they've got to have certifications that are very complicated, they won't adopt. It's got to be easy to adopt, easy to self-certify to. In the same way as we just talked about open banking, really, the whole premise of that in terms of being able to, a TPP, third-party processor, being able to access bank data with a kind of minimal light touch identification of who they are, needs to be the same for anyone consuming IDs in the future.
We've been involved in a series of projects about pensions dashboard with a range of people, some of whom are in the room and indeed on the stage. Some of those have been under the OIX banner, but all of them have been cross-industry, cross-sector efforts. The idea of pensions dashboard, we're starting to call it open pensions, is the idea that you can see all of your pension entitlements, state, from an employer or an individual, together online. And there are many similarities with open banking, but many differences as well. So no Payment Services Directive yet. We're working on the legislation. We've said that there should be. One of the main functions is that you need to find pensions that you may not even know you've got. Pensions industry is quite different from the banking industry. And it includes state pension data as well as private pension data. So where we are now is we've set out a series of recommendations to government, and DWP have committed to doing a feasibility study for how this can be delivered. And the Pensions Minister has been very enthusiastic indeed about it. Earlier this year, we presented a demo of the prototype to the then Pensions Minister, and we'll show the video now.
Did you know we could have up to 11 different jobs in our lifetime?
This means we could gather up to 11 different pension pots, and 1 out of every 3 of us find it hard to keep track of them. Now, however, government, industry and development partners are working together to make everyone's pensions easier to manage. We're proud to present the Pensions Dashboard Prototype Project. We've built an infrastructure prototype which could one day work to give people easy access to all their pension information in one place of their choice. The theory is simple. It's a 4-step process: verifying your identity, giving consent to securely share your data, searching for the pension pots, and presenting all of the details in the same place. Let's look at Noah, who's a few years away from retirement. He knows he has several pensions, but he's struggling to find them all and so make better plans for his future. Noah has already registered with gov.uk Verify, having already checked his state pension online. It's easy for him to log in to a pensions dashboard to find all his pensions by verifying his identity in a similar way. only Noah can access his pensions. Strict data standards mean that it's only his own data that Noah can see. Personal data is protected by law. Noah must proactively consent to his details being shared. Data such as his national insurance number, date of birth and surname that can identify him uniquely and make sure of retrieving his pension data, his alone. Without Noah's consent, the dashboard can't help him. No data is shared. Noah waits a few seconds while the dashboard starts retrieving data from registered providers. Some may connect directly, some may connect through trusted third parties. Here come the details. The dashboard has found 7 pensions plus his state pension. Noah sees the estimated total valuation. It's a handy summary, and it's clear that this is only an estimate. The regulators will have to decide what can and can't be shown beyond the basic information from each separate pension found. Noah can look into each pension a little more. Clicking on his state pension shows information from DWP, the same data he'd see by going through the Check State Pension Service. Clicking through into his other pensions, Noah can see some more details and the contact information for each provider. How does this all work? A pension finder service enables secure communications between all pension providers, dashboard hosts, and industry partners who are involved with the systems. If Noah can't see one of his pensions, he can make contact with the provider. The details are all listed for him to browse. He knows his data is safe and how to find out more about his savings for the future. Making plans is easier when you can see how much you've already saved and find all the information about your pension pots at the same time. Thank you for watching this introduction to the Pensions Dashboard prototype. For more information, visit pensionsdashboardproject.uk.
Thank you. Any more you want to share with us about that one?
The website's live. It's got the report of both projects, including, I guess for this audience, some of the more detailed data specs. I'll just add to that, you see some very basic identity stuff. One of the challenges, I think one of the successes, but one of the challenges of this project was bringing together the pensions people and the technology people. And I'd say the biggest knowledge gap among the pensions people is about identity. So don't underestimate how little people know in the general population, but in the industry, about identity, GDPR, let alone digital identity.
The commercial reuse of Verify is really quite an exciting concept. If it were to be put in place, I think the real value for everyone would be on using it to log into services as opposed to actually using it to sign up for services. The OAX has completed quite a lot of projects which really kind of look at using Verify as a way to sign up for a new service. Really, so how we look at it from the consumer point of view, using Verify to sign up for a service doesn't really make it that much easier for a consumer. It makes it much easier for the issuing party to verify the identity. So what you really need to do is to look at kind of what would make it easier for the consumer. And to really do that, to use that type of service, you need to involve some sort of attributes exchange. So the vision that we have within Lexis is really to make it easier for consumers to sign up for goods, to be able to use their data. We see the data that we hold as being the consumer's data that they can kind of access through services.
I've recently joined MasterCard, as Tiffany mentioned, to look at digital identity. So it's great to be back. I would say that this is a topic, unfortunately, that doesn't sleep. We've been at it for a while here, but the bad guys continue to get more sophisticated every day, right? And that's just the nature of the problem that we're dealing with. And with respect to identity validation, I do think we're in the mode of looking at probably four key things, right? One is the movement from using static and secret data to validate that it's done, to beginning to use dynamic and biometric data. So theme number one, and I think this is an incredibly important point. The second, in many respects, we'd say that services for consumers today, particularly as they might relate to identity, if we thought about how we might play with social media or others. In many respects, consumer is actually the ID product, right? That's kind of the paradigm today. And I think with some of the regs that do come with GDPR and with the new frame that we'll begin to see with digital identity services, this is really all about servicing the needs of the consumer. The consumer is very, very critical to get to the center of this. As well, this is for sure a community initiative, right? The notion of digital identity in many respects is not taking my passport and digitizing it and say, here, we're done, right? This is a notion of a collage of me, in the context of a persona, the collage of me as it begins to evolve over time. So it's, in many respects, digital ID it's not the credential, it's not the passport, it's a process, and it's really the bringing together of data about me, most of which I already know and I can assert, but it really comes down to the government or the bank or the M&O, the post, the credit rating agency and others to bring together color about who I'm all about. So doing that in a transparent, open ecosystem is really key. And so this movement from doing this under the covers to doing this in a broader way. And the last is really the movement to what is likely fast on-demand networks to check and to validate. That the notion that my passport was issued in 2012 and that it's still good today is kind of okay, but that may not pass the bar for what I'm trying to do online, right? So this notion of saying I've got data that I validated at a point in time, it is all about fast real-time validation. So that's probably maybe the first thing. I'd say the second, if we can advance, is really, why is MasterCard involved in this? And in some respects, when you think about it, MasterCard's core business in payments is really all about facilitating the interaction of consumers and merchants. And in many respects, identity is very central. Who's the merchant, who's the consumer? So we have interest in this topic very much because of that, as more and more we do is driven into digital. The second is that we've done an awful lot in the area of fraud and risk assessment. And when we begin to think about this topic, it's not just dealing with this in a black-white way, but beginning to take signals in, to take decisions, and to take fraudulent action out to the community as well. So the gives and takes in signal sharing, there's been a lot of good work done here in that regard. Our company as well has made a very passionate commitment to inclusion, financial inclusion, and in many respects of the 1.1 billion people around the globe that are in a more diminished capacity there. They also don't have ID. So a lot of this starts with identity inclusion. Lastly, when we do look at this notion of digital identity here or in Australia or in Germany is all really cool. On the other hand, we're pretty global, and being able to interoperate both at the core level and in the area of attributes is really important. So with that, we think we've done a pretty good job at helping to bring together 22,000 banks, 45 million merchants in 200 countries for 50 years, and have made the notion of conducting a transaction pretty simple for the consumer. And I think that this consumer experience of making it simple, making it value added, is really, really important for us to be thinking about. So I'd say lastly, in the next slide, if we could advance, I do believe we're at a stage now within the markets here in the UK where we've gotten to the point where Verify has represented a great national standard, a touchstone, a thing that we can go back to, that government declares to be appropriate, that has certified or accredited 7 agencies that are doing that in a compliant manner. Really well done. I think this group and this community that Don and Sue and others have created with participation from from many others, has done some wonderful work in looking at the business and the application and the use case. The other observation I would say is that as consumers, 90% of what we do that's important online is not government related, right? There's a lot that we do that is, but much of what we do is not. The points I've made about the identity bar continuing to rise, and then the importance that there's not one company on the planet, one government on the planet, one agency on the planet that can solve this problem. It's an ecosystem problem, and it's actually why this stuff is very, very difficult. To me, and we had this discussion at our speakers dinner last night, I think 2018 represents a very important time for public sector to step forward. That government has carried this ball with Verify and the standard set to a degree. I think what's really important now is for the private sector to begin coming together in this year to kind of get on with it. And that's going to be actually really critical for global interop, right? When you begin thinking about organizations such as HSBC that operate in X countries around the planet, dealing with Verify here likely doesn't help them much in Australia or Canada or other key markets. So getting interoperability right is key. We believe, and we're still really working through the notion of what we might do, but we're hopeful that we can be a participant in perhaps helping to orchestrate some of the pragmatics in making the private sector commercial reality move, and we look forward to that in the year. So I'd say with that, Tiffany, this is a year where I think private sector leadership, and this is not to say that it's anything other than working now in greater collaboration with government, M&O, bank, bureau, and post. But that's pretty key. The government plays a key role in that there are important ways to validate data about ourselves through government databases. Those APIs need to be opened up and made available. Those are really important. And the notion of how to govern or deal with this needs to be brought to bear. I think with that, a lot of the great work that's been done to date starts to become unleashed very fast, right? There's a lot of great cases I know from the panelists today.
What do you believe should be done in the UK market to catalyse the deployment of digital identity ecosystem service for public and private use? And you've spoken a little bit about that just now, but why act now?
I think there's been a great work in setting a standard, a national bar called Verify, which I think is incredibly important here, and as well the same for other places. We need to now have the formal, clear mechanism in place to allow that to be used within the private sector. So that's pretty key. We need to open up government APIs to allow for validation of our documents with government, and we need to set a model in place for the private sector to collaborate commercially to make it a reality. I think those are probably the three things.
Any other points from the panelists on the trade-off between security and usability you've also found in your work before we move on to standards?
I think there's a little bit around what different segments of customers expect as well, and what defines ease for them, because I think of certain, when I'm logging into my online banking as an example, I quite like the fact that it takes me 10, 15 seconds. There's something about it that it makes it feel a bit secure. Sure. So actually, whilst potentially I could have an easier and quicker journey, actually for some high value transactions like that feels right. So I think, going back to the point I said at the very start, with open banking and the way in which that's going to be implemented, it's going to be really interesting to see what customers, outside of research groups, actually are doing in reality, and where the problems start popping up with security, and then how that actually trade-off ends up balancing. I can't answer it, but I don't think anybody can until actually it starts happening.
Thank you. Yes, certainly.
If I could, well, on a security point of view, passwords are rubbish, aren't they? I mean, they're dreadful, and they need to go. I mean, many of you run businesses which issue passwords. The cost of managing them, resetting them, dealing with customers who've forgotten them is just colossal, and they're not very secure. People write them down. They get phished. They get stolen in data breaches. So they're really not great. and as we're now seeing kind of biometrics emerge, which are much easier to use if you've got the right equipment to do so, then it feels like there's a time that, you know, the 20, 30-year reliance on password is, you know, surely coming to an end now, and we need to move on to more secure ways of doing that feel more secure as well. To your point, you know, doing a biometric, you know, inherently feels like a secure way of unlocking something. So does a password, but it's very cumbersome.